Karl Benz spent most of his life in near poverty and constant mockery as he tried to change the way the world got around. If it wasn't for his business partners, it probably would have happened 20 years earlier. And if it wasn't for his wife, it wouldn't have happened at all. Carl Friedrich Michael Valent was born in November 1844 to his soon-to-be married parents, and as such, he was given the name of his mother, Josephine Valent. When Carl was 2 years old, his father, Johann, a train engineer, was called to help a colleague whose train had derailed when a distracted switch operator tried to make a last-minute change, causing the locomotive to jump the tracks and come to an abrupt halt in the dirt. All night in the cold and the rain, Johann and the other men worked between pulling with Johann's train and manually adjusting the stuck steam engine. Eventually, the train was returned to normal operations and everyone's jobs were saved. But not without a price. Drivers' cabins were uncovered at the time, and between a pre-existing cold and the bad weather, Johann fell sick with pneumonia. And within a week, he was gone, leaving Josephine and the young Karl behind. In remembrance, Karl's mother changed his last name to match that of his late father, Johann Georg Benz. Josephine was granted a small stipend that was enough to feed them, but that was about it. Not wanting her son to be raised without an opportunity, she went to work as a chef to keep them just above the poverty line. With the money she earned, she was able to get Karl an education, something not guaranteed in those days. And Karl worked in kind to be the best student he could be. About the same time, Karl was just old enough to start school. 20 miles away in the town of Pforzheim on May 3rd, 1849, Cecilia Bertha Ringer was born. The third child and third daughter of parents August Friedrich and Karl Friedrich Ringer, because it's 1840s Germany and everyone must be named Friedrich, with an adequately large subset of Friedrichs also being named Karl. When Bertha was born, her father allegedly wrote in the family Bible, "Unfortunately, another girl." See, Karl Ringer was a master carpenter who had become wealthy in real estate speculation and wanted a son to take over his business. Still, Bertha had about the exact opposite upbringing of Karl Benz. There was always plenty of food and clothes that fit properly. Her mother stayed home, and due to her father's money, he was able to comfortably send her and her eventual 8 siblings to high-end boarding school. Meanwhile, Karl Benz was just finishing at the local primary school and enrolling in the local lyceum, essentially a middle school/high school with specialized curriculum. This one specialized in sciences. While studying at the Lyceum, Karl initially focused on locksmithing, but soon traded that in to pursue his father's passion of locomotives, much to the chagrin of his mother, who had lost her husband to the locomotive trade. Nevertheless, she supported him in any way she could. Any money not spent on keeping them fed or Karl's education was spent on Karl's education. His mother built him a small laboratory in their house, stocked with hand tools, burners, beakers, locally available chemicals, lenses, and the like. Here, Karl would spend his afternoons building things and undertaking experiments like separating hydrogen gas out from water, an endeavor that more than once ended in a small explosion, splattering the acid used in the process all over his laboratory. However, this isn't a comic book, so instead of leaving him with a disfigured face and beginning his villain origin story, it just stained his clothes a bit. Which did get him ridiculed at school, but apparently he wasn't a little crybaby, so he didn't let that turn him into a meth-addled genocidal maniac and a terrible artist to boot. What are we talking about? Oh, yeah, Karl did more than stain his clothes with his home lab, though. His father had left him 5 pocket watches, 2 of which were sacrificed on the altar of curiosity, as he taught himself watchmaking. But their sacrifices were not in vain, as he was able to use that knowledge to begin making money servicing watches for the neighbors. His work ethic, persistent nature, and practical skills made Karl an exceptional student, which led him to being accepted into the Karlsruhe Polytechnic Institute at the age of 17. Today known as the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, while Karl was there, he studied mechanical engineering under a man named Ferdinand Redenbacher, who became famous for founding science-based mechanical engineering. If you're an engineering student, he's why you have to take DFEQ and can't just build things all day. Unless, of course, you're a computer engineering student, then you don't have to take DFEQ and probably don't care about building things because you're not a real engineer and should stop calling yourself that. Despite his analytical nature, though, it was in Professor Ferdinand's ability to explain practical machinery that Karl found inspiration. Later in life, Karl recalled the lectures, saying, quote, "One could almost hear the machines running." And this is after apparently his lectures had staled from a persistent illness he was dealing with. Nevertheless, under Redenbacher's tutelage, Karl shed his fascination with trains and began looking towards the future. He sought to go beyond the world of steam engines, where one struggled for a few percent more efficiency, and to a new form of power generation. Though neither he nor his mentor were sure what that looked like yet. Unfortunately, before either could find an answer, Professor Redenbacher would pass away from his illness in April of 1863. Karl was one of the students that carried his casket. Redenbacher's successor was Franz Grashoff. While Redenbacher was a gifted lecturer, Grashoff was a gifted scientist. His lectures were rigorous without flavor, using only small sketches at best. While tough to follow, their content prepared Karl for the rest of his life. Finally, he found one last mentor in the shopmaster, who helped Karl become a better craftsman and furthered his appreciation for working with his hands. Which is accurate, shopmasters do be inspiring you to do fun stuff. Through these mentors, Karl found inspiration for what would become his destiny. He made up his mind to make a vehicle not unlike his father's that drove without horses, but it would be even better. This one wouldn't require rails. What he called a self-driving road vehicle. In July 1864, with his education complete, Karl graduated and set out into the world. While Karl was graduating, Bertha was encountering one of the few obstacles her father's money couldn't overcome. At 10 years old, she had discovered the note her father left in the family Bible. Already having been interested in her father's construction work and the various machines found around at the time, she decided to prove that she was indeed not just another girl. While in school, she focused on the sciences, learning as much as a girl could in the 1860s German boarding school. At home, she could be found asking her father to explain his work in great detail, often at the expense of the more womanly chores she was expected to learn, which I'm sure won her a stern talking on more than one occasion. But the pursuit of knowledge had other obstacles than an upset mother. Women weren't allowed to attend universities in Germany until around 1900. So when she completed boarding school, that was the end of her education, at least in the formal sense. Having finished his formal education, Karl set out to make something of himself. As he saw, a more complete engineer. Instead of going directly into an engineering role, he decided to learn what it took to manufacture things, with a very hands-on approach. At least that's what he said was the reasoning. Yeah, sure, buddy. And I painted houses to learn how the liveries are applied to airplanes. We all got bills, brother. Regardless of the reason, he took a job at the local Karlsruhe Machine Works locomotive factory. This allowed him to get the hands-on experience he was looking for and remain close to his mother, who had grown sick in her old age after years of tireless work to put Karl through school. There he would work from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m., 6 days a week, drilling and filing components that were destined for trains, all the while appreciating the magnificent constructions and simultaneously wanting to free them from their rails. Eventually, when his mother recovered and she was well enough, he felt comfortable leaving her while he moved a few towns over to Mannheim and took his first real engineering role designing cranes and other industrial equipment. While in Mannheim, he also acquired an early safety-type bicycle, or as we call it, a bicycle. Basically, anything that wasn't a penny farthing was considered a safety type. The bike was heavy, being made of wood and iron-rimmed wheels like a wagon. While Karl thoroughly enjoyed the contraption as a novel way to get to the pubs, it convinced him that whatever his vehicle would be, it had to completely remove human power from the motion of the vehicle, and it had to have more than 2 wheels. Presumably because pedaling uphill is exhausting and it's really difficult to stay upright after a good night on the town. They hadn't invented the DUI yet. Karl stayed in Mannheim for 2 years before going to work at a bridge building company in the town of Pforzheim. But while he was there, he gained a lot more than bridge building experience. While attending a trip with the local sporting club in June of 1869, Bertha Ringer met an interesting young man. Below her status and wealth, what he lacked in material content, he more than made up for in the content of his conversation. At least as far as Bertha was concerned. While Karl's rambling of internal combustion engines and a world of transportation freed from rails or beasts may have induced the yawning to most women at the time, to Bertha, it was riveting. Which is good because apparently he wasn't very good at talking about anything else. Karl was equally delighted to meet someone who could meet his enthusiasm for the world of engineering. Describing their shared enthusiasm, later in life he said, quote, "What until then had been a plan and a dream, now had to take flight and soar into action. All belief and hope, all struggle and wrestling, but also all fulfillment and completion, now became a passionate shared experience." The meeting was a fortuitous one, but not a moment too soon, as the following spring, Karl's mother passed away. A terrible thing to experience at just 26, but now, with nobody left to take care of and a healthy academic and hands-on education, Karl was ready to try and make his mark on the world. By 1871, Karl had moved back to Mannheim to start his own shop called the Iron Foundry and Mechanical Workshop, along with a friend named August Ritter. However, Ritter quickly proved to be unreliable and nearly brought the little metal foundry to ruin. It would have likely completely failed if it weren't for the help of Bertha. Being an unmarried woman of a wealthy family, she was allotted a dowry that was intended to help her attract a wealthy suitor. Instead, much to the chagrin of her father, she decided to take that money out early and use it to buy Ritter out of his share. thereby saving the company and allowing Karl to continue his efforts. Karl, who at this point had proven himself to be a pretty smart guy, continued that trend and married Bertha the next year. While running their little foundry, they started a family with their first child born in 73, then another in 74, and a third in 77. At one point, the business was almost lost again when the town bailiffs confiscated their machinery to pay debts. Undeterred, the Benzes continued with hand tools. Any money or time not spent at the foundry or children was spent developing a new engine, a gas-powered internal combustion engine, which itself wasn't a novel concept. Nicholas Otto patented the four-stroke Otto cycle in 1877, and there were a few other attempts before. But the development was necessary, as Karl saw it as not only a way to make money, but more importantly, a way to produce a power supply reliable, small, and powerful enough to finally realize his vision of a horseless, railless vehicle. However, Otto had the German four-stroke patent, which meant Karl had to come up with something new: the two-stroke engine. So you probably already know how a regular four-stroke engine works, but just in case you don't, here's how it works. The intake valve opens as the piston moves down, drawing in fresh air and fuel. The intake valve is then closed and the piston moves up, compressing that mixture of air and fuel. The mixture is ignited from its compressed state and rapidly expands, creating power. Then the exhaust valve opens and the piston moves up, pushing our spent mixture. That's the four strokes of a four-stroke engine: intake, compression, expansion, and exhaust. Now, this process was patented because apparently you can own processes of nature. So instead, Karl had to come up with this: the two-stroke engine. As you might have guessed, it only has two strokes. One for compression and another for expansion, intake, and exhaust, sort of all at once. The way it worked was actually pretty neat. Obviously, you had your piston moving up and down, but it didn't have the same valving. When the piston would move up, a valve would open, letting air from the atmosphere fill into the crankcase area essentially below the piston. Then when the piston moves downward, the first valve closes and another valve opens, allowing the air to be pushed into this reservoir. Because that air is squeezed into the reservoir at a higher pressure, it pushes its way into the cylinder, which then pushes the exhaust out, so you get fresh air. For fuel, there's a little mechanical fuel pump right here that used a little piston to push fuel into the cylinder, which means that this was actually fuel injected and not carbureted. Arguably the first direct injected engine. Then the piston comes up, compressing the mixture and starting the whole process over again. Now, you might be clever enough to wonder, why have a reservoir at all? Why not just pump the air directly into the cylinder? And the answer is, I don't know. But that's how they do it today. It's called crankcase scavenging. This is kind of what a modern two-stroke looks like. There's a one-way valve called a reed valve that opens up out of the way as the piston moves up and draws air into the crankcase. Then, as the piston moves down, the reed valves close down and the air moves up into the piston, scavenging and pushing out the exhaust. Scavenging is just a word to say replacing spent charge with clean charge. There are other ways it can be done, but that's not what this video is about. In fact, the only reason I mentioned modern day crankcase scavenging is to point out how close Karl's idea really was to what we still do today. He pretty much got it right from the start with a few extra components. It's pretty neat. There was another guy who invented a two-stroke at the same time Karl did, but used a whole second piston for scavenging. It looked like this, which is big and unwieldy. It's awful. Karl and Bertha toiled with the design for months, constantly tinkering with it, but only ever to get random pops out of it before it sputtered to a halt. Then on New Year's Eve, 1879, after finishing dinner, Bertha turned to Karl and said, "We must go to the workshop and try our luck again," noting that something was calling her and she couldn't sleep until they figured out the engine. That something might have been the looming ruin, as they had spent every penny they had on this venture, but chalking it up to the ether is far more comforting. So they returned to their workshop, and without adjusting anything, Karl spun the big flywheel and was greeted with the rhythmic pattern of a thumping piston. The piston churned as they stood there amazed. Finally, the machine had awoken, and it stayed awake as they sat there for over an hour listening to it thump. The reality is they probably got it right earlier in the day and had flooded it, so it just needed a little time to off-gas, but the thought of sheer willpower being the deciding factor is cooler, so we're going to go with that. Now, with technology in hand, they began the hardest part of engineering a new product: selling it. Most people were too stuck on steam engines to see the value of an internal combustion engine and refused to invest. However, it wasn't long before a local court photographer, who Karl had done some work for, heard about the engine and approached Benz with an investment. Before long, the company was putting engines in every factory and workshop in town. They quickly grew from 6 employees to over 40 and moved from Karl's workshop to a new factory. They grew so fast the bank decided it was too much risk having all that capital wrapped up in one workshop that could falter, so they forced Karl and his partner to go public. So the Mannheimer Gas and Motor Fabric was founded, and was to be invested in and partly controlled by the exact same people who couldn't see the value of the internal combustion engine. That went exactly as you think it would. The engines got built, but anytime Karl tried to push boundaries, he was shut down. The engine was made to make money, yes, but much more, it was built for a vehicle. But anytime Karl tried to make that vehicle, his new business partners wouldn't let him invest company time and resources. Instead of his company freeing him to grow, it had become a cage that made sure he never ventured too far outside the comfort zone of the less insightful. So Karl was restricted to only being able to develop his designs in the late hours of the day after work. But there's only so many hours in the day, and work was taking too many of them, so he did what any self-respecting eccentric inventor would do and quit. While maintaining his shares, Benz left the company he started and returned to his workshop to continue his endeavors. Once again, Karl and Bertha began building engines in their workshop, improving upon the designs he had left behind. It wasn't long, however, before Max Rose, a local bike shop owner, came along and began investing in the Benz name. As Karl had become fond of riding his bicycle, which he named the Bone Shaker, he and Rose had become friends. So, together they formed Benz & Cie, which just means Benz & Company, in 1883. Apparently bicycles had also caught on quite well by this point because Rose essentially cut Karl and Bertha a blank check to develop their engines pretty much however they saw fit. One major improvement they implemented during their initial startup was a dynamo-powered spark ignition, which is much more reliable than the hot tube ignition that was common at the time. Hot tube ignition is literally just heating a ceramic tube and sticking it in the engine, so when the fuel and air charge is compressed, the heat of the tube kicks off the ignition. Sort of like a glow plug in old diesels, but kept hot with just a small flame. Anyway, within the year, Benz & Cie was competing with their old company, and bringing in enough money that they could begin work on Karl's dream, the motor wagon. Finally, 20 years of drawings rolled out to display precise plans showing every detail of a world-altering machine. Every bolt, spring, and chain link was meticulously accounted for. All that was left was to build it. And Karl quickly learned a lesson that every mechanic and assembler would tell you the second they find out that you're an engineer. Just because it fits in CAD doesn't mean it works in real life. Look, I'm sorry you had to build the intern's project one time, but if you don't hold that against us, I won't hold your unwillingness to read directions against you. Anyway, it turns out that just because he drew everything out to fit together doesn't mean everything was going to go together. There's no such thing as a perfect part, and Karl's experience at the mill was never more useful. Many parts had to be made and then reshaped to fit. And when they did fit, some still had to be remade as his calculations hadn't always accounted for every load, and some things just needed to be beefier. Tirelessly, he worked with his wife by his side, who, by the way, was still doing most of the child rearing, including a 4th child that was only a toddler at this point. Altogether, the work took a little over a year. They did, however, catch a break when it was found that Otto had made a mistake in his patent application, causing it to slide, which meant Karl could use a lighter weight 4-stroke engine instead of the heavier 2-stroke, which isn't true today. Like, if you know about engines, you know that a 2-stroke's lighter, but it was at the time. Finally, in early spring of 1885, over 20 years after the passing of the mentor who instilled him with the dream, and nearly as long since he had lost the woman who raised him, surrounded by family, friends, and employees, Karl breathed life into a machine that would do nothing shy of change the course of history. A tribute to the people that built him, the Benz patent motor wagon rattled to life with a single spin of the flywheel. Karl wasted no time and immediately hopped in to drive it around the courtyard, which he did precariously as he hadn't taken driver's ed yet, and throttle control is always tricky for new drivers. It wasn't long before the motor wagon graduated from the courtyard to the courthouse as Karl began taking it around town. Not everyone was as pleased as Karl in his inner circle, though. In fact, everyone was pretty upset about the smelly loud contraption clicking down the street, and they had no issue informing Karl how they felt. From scoffs and dirty looks as he drove by, to outright mockery and belittling when it broke down. Many times, Karl and Bertha would be working on the motor wagon, or just pushing it home, and any chance people got, they would take shots at Karl to remind him that horses in fact existed, and his endeavors were clearly a waste of time. But That didn't stop Karl. He just shifted to testing at night, which I imagine didn't make the residents of Mannheim any happier, but you gotta be a special level of petty to get out of bed, get dressed, go out on the street, and track someone down just to hate on their dreams. And since Curtis Jackson III wouldn't be born for another 90 years, Karl was safe from mockery. After several months of being what I can only imagine was an absolute neighborhood menace, Karl finally got the motor wagon to a reliable, drivable state, and on January 29, 1886, he submitted a patent for the first, quote, vehicle with gas engine operation, making it officially the first car. With the vehicle in working order, Karl immediately began working on new models. By the time the second and third versions came along, the motor wagons were operating with a lot of the same ideas that move your car around today. They had the same spark ignition from the Benz two-stroke engine, with coils that Bertha had wound by modifying her sewing machine. The drive lines were clutch for start and stop operations. They also had 2-speed planetary gearbox transmissions. And while they were belt driven to the axle, within that axle was a differential that allowed the driving wheels to turn independently in corners. And of course, the power was sent to the rear wheels the way God intended. They're also carbureted, which isn't common today, but it was until like the 1980s, and Karl did something really cool with the carburetor, so I want to talk about it. I've explained before how carburetors work, but as a quick refresher, drag air in, the air passes through a venturi, lowering the pressure, pulling the fuel from the bowl into the airstream, and then the airstream flows into your engine. Now, in Karl's time, they used something called a surface carburetor, which looked something like this. It was really simple, and he just used this tube with a plate on the end of it that floated on top of all of the fuel. All of the fuel was kept inside of your carburetor. As the fuel would lower or raise, the plate would go with it, and the entire point was to spread as much air across as much surface of your fuel as possible. And that air would bubble through the fuel and then mix with the fuel and evaporate up and then out into the engine. There were a couple things that weren't great about this idea. The major one being that the more volatile components would evaporate first, and as you ran the engine, you would be left with higher concentrations of more stable components and like undesirable particles, which didn't ignite very well. So Karl invented this carburetor. First, he implemented a float to separate the majority of the fuel from the air path. He then submerged the air inlet in the fuel, so instead of just evaporating the fuel off the top, there was force through the fuel, which prevented favoritism of more volatile components. On the way out, the charge would go up and around this conical pipe and through this double switchback, which prevented liquid fuel from entering into the intake manifold, instead only letting the evaporated components through. Finally, and this is the really neat part, the exhaust from the engine was allowed to pass through the tube below the carburetor. As fuel evaporates, it can cool down to the point where it can freeze inside the carburetor, which was also in my P38 video, and you can check that out next. I think it's pretty neat too. Anyway, by running the exhaust under the carburetor is kept from freezing, even on the coldest days. Also, it would help evaporate the fuel as warmer fluids are more readily evaporated. But the neatest part about this, it's not a very good idea. At least, not today. It worked fine when engines were running on like a 4-to-1 compression ratio and not getting very hot. But today we're trying to squeeze every bit of energy out of every drop of fuel, and that means engines run a lot hotter. But if they're too hot, with flame temperatures above like 2800 Fahrenheit, they create significantly more NOx pollutants, which are real bad for human consumption. Believe it or not, preheating your fuel just a few degrees can have a significant impact on how hot your engine gets without giving you any extra power, so we would never do this today. And that's what I think is really cool. I love learning about things people have tried, even if that idea isn't around anymore. Maybe they worked at the time, maybe they never worked, or maybe the world just wasn't ready and they'll work one day. And if you also think that's cool, then maybe consider subscribing, because that's what I do here. Learn about neat ideas and then tell people about them. And if you're one of the, as of recording, 69 nice subscribers, sorry I haven't been around. I got a new job and I've been readjusting to normal adult life and taking care of real responsibilities. But hopefully I'll have more videos more often. Anyway, back to the Benz cars. As Karl was making these new models, he also began trying to market the cars, taking them to the fairs and trade shows, showing them off to newspapers, anything he could to get the word out. He sold a few in France and England, but not enough to keep the lights on, and specifically none in Germany, which really broke his heart. In fact, the only attention he was getting from the fatherland was from the government, who, as soon as they heard about the motor wagon, put a 6 km/h speed limit on motor vehicles. Karl quickly defeated this by inviting the officials to come out and talk and inspect the cars. When the men arrived at the train station, they were met with one of Karl's employees in a car who was to drive them back to the shop. Of course, at 6 kilometers an hour. While on their way there, they were getting passed by every manner of cart and buggy, to include the milkman being pulled by his donkey. The short trip was so excruciatingly slow that by the time they arrived at the shop, the speed limit had already been lifted. Like, they actually told the driver, just drive faster. But that still didn't stop the town government from making Karl get a driver's license on August 1st, 1888, which is the most German thing ever. As soon as there's a new idea, there must be rules about it. I can only imagine what the session to decide that looked like.
Unser erster Tagesordnungspunkt. Ein Mann hat einen Motorwagen erfunden.
Ja, das habe ich gesehen. Was sollen wir tun?
Natürlich darf es nicht einfach so fahren.
Natürlich nicht. Wir werden von ihm verlangen, dass er eine Lizenz hat.
Dann können wir nachverfolgen, wer einen Motorwagen nutzt.
Vielleicht führen wir sogar einen Test ein, um sicher zu sein, dass die Leute wissen, wie man fährt.
Wunderbar, du bist ein kluger Mensch.
Und ich sage mir glücklich, dich an Freund zu haben. Danke, mir geht es mit dir genauso.
Nun zum nächsten Punkt der Tagesordnung. Wie viele Luftballons sind zu viele?
100. Was ist das Schlimmste, was passieren kann? Another first happened just 4 days later on the morning of August 5th. Karl awoke to find his third car had been stolen. Expertly and silently, it was taken away under the guise of night. Or like, kinda early morning. The mystery didn't last long though, as Bertha had been planning a trip to visit her mother 66 miles away in Pforzheim. And given that she and their 2 oldest boys were gone with the motor wagon, it was pretty obvious that they had taken it. I imagine she also left the first "I've taken the car to see my mother" note in history. But it's more fun to say that she was the first person to commit Grand Theft Auto. Regardless, she decided Karl was being too modest, simply putting them around town and taking them to trade shows. What the world needed was a demonstration. The trip was to be no joyride though. Once again, this was going to be 66 miles. A horse is good for about 20 in a day. Nothing short of a locomotive could hope of making that trip. The fuel tank of the motor wagon held just over a gallon of fuel. There were no gas stations because there was like 4 cars at this point. But Bertha was prepared. She mapped out the apothecaries who would carry a solvent that Karl had spec'd for the fuel of his engines. A substance called Legroin. As they set out, they pushed the motor wagon until they were far enough away that Karl wouldn't wake up. Then began their drive. It was smooth driving until Weissloch. Weissloch? I don't know how to say that. After that, the hills start. On the steep uphills, Bertha and the oldest son, Eugen, had to get out and push. On the downhills, they would cook the leather brake pads to the point where they regularly needed to buy replacements at the local cobblers as they went through towns. At some point, the chain had stretched so much they had to get it repaired at a blacksmith. The fuel line clogged, so Bertha had to take her hat pin out and clear it. The ignition failed, and Bertha repaired it by using her garter as insulation, which I think means the wire had abraded to the point it was shorting to the frame of the wagon. The whole journey continued this way, but while it took some love and care to get there, the car never left them completely stranded without a way forward, and eventually they wired to Karl, quote, "arrived happily in Pforzheim." To which he responded, "send the chains back immediately," assumingly knowing they were stretched and needed fixed. Eventually he calmed down and sent them new chains to make the return trip, which was made a week later with fewer difficulties, and by the end of it, they had completed their mission of proving to the world and Karl that his motor wagon not only worked, but was a complete success. Or that's how the story goes. According to Karl, the real motivation for the trip was that it was summer vacation and his boys wanted to go do something, so knowing he would say no, they convinced their mother to go on a trip with them. It's possible that Bertha decided this would be a good publicity stunt, or maybe she just wanted to go see her mom. Regardless, intentional or not, the publicity stunt worked and the Benz cars finally started selling. In the next models, Karl would improve the motor wagons by adding a 4th wheel and rubber tires. And more importantly, at the insistence of Bertha and the boys, he added a 3rd gear for climbing hills. Over the next 17 years or so, the Benz name would grow from just a local engine manufacturer to a world-renowned revolutionary. Their lineup would increase to include a 4-seat vehicle, covered vehicles, and even buses. Their most popular model was the Velo, which they sold over 1,200 of. He also made a stop along the way to invent the Boxer engine. And then, in 1906, Karl did the funniest thing in his life. After quarreling with his chief engineer, a Frenchman who would rather build fast cars than practical ones, he restarted. He didn't sell his shares or step down as director or anything. He just moved 10 kilometers east to Ladenburg and decided to start over, founding a new company with his wife and children, making cars that would directly compete with his already existing company while still being heavily tied to the original company. The new company, called C. Benz Sohn, was founded with their own capital and remained privately owned within the family until they closed up shop in 1923. They had a reasonable success throughout the life of the company, being specifically popular with London taxi drivers. Mostly without Karl, though, as in 1912 he sold his shares in the company to his kids and returned full-time to running Benz & Cie, where he would remain at least as a board member for the rest of his life. In 1914, he was given an honorary doctorate from his alma mater. In 1914, he was given an honorary doctorate from his alma mater. As the years went by, Karl aged and he got to see his invention spread the world over, not just from Benz but also from competitors like Daimler and Ford. As cars became a common mode of transportation and racing a form of entertainment, car clubs began to spring up. One such car club happened to have a 25-year anniversary the same year the Deutsche Museum hosted the Transport Exposition. To celebrate, they brought Karl's now completely outdated first model car out of the museum, and had the now 81-year-old inventor lead the way as a procession of vehicles ranging from his 0.75 horsepower patent motor wagon up to thundering 200 horsepower sports cars paraded down the streets. The old steed reportedly performed admirably, as thousands of people watched and cheered at the display of dreams realized. A far cry from the scowls and callous laughter that had greeted him when he began this journey. Karl would live to see the merger with Daimler, forming the Daimler-Benz company, and eventually the formation of the modern Mercedes-Benz. Then, after a particularly cold winter in 1929, Karl fell ill. When the news of his failing health was announced on April 2, 1929, thousands of motorists from around the country flocked to drive by his house and pay respects. As Karl was too sick to get out of his bed to observe them, much less address them, the messages had to be relayed by Bertha and other family members. Nonetheless, the procession served as one last affirmation to the old inventor that he was right. Karl would die 2 days later. Mercedes-Benz obviously still exists today, but so does the original gas motor fabric that he founded and left in search of building his cars. And they're still making small engines. Bertha remained in their home for the rest of her life. She would also pass just 2 days after receiving a great honor when the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology granted her the title of Honorary Senator on her 95th birthday in May 3, 1944. A late recognition for her contribution to the engineering world, something that would continue until recently. For example, Karl was inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame in 1984, which was honestly already late. But Bertha wasn't inducted until 2016. While it's easy enough to find an article or even a few books about Bertha Benz now, it seems like for a little bit, everyone kind of forgot about her. Everyone except Karl, who wrote in his autobiography, quote, "Only one person stayed beside me in the little ship of life during those days when things were heading towards ruin. That was my wife. She did not tremble before life's onslaught. Bravely and courageously, she hoisted new sails of hope." And that's the story of Karl and Bertha Benz, who changed the world through ingenuity, determination, and utmost faith in each other. Moral of the story, if she won't use her inheritance to pay for you to chase your dreams, she isn't living up to the standard. Know your worth, King.